We need to clear space, declared my sister-in-law, packing my things. Mom and Dad are moving in next weekend. My husband looked like a ghost. You want my apartment? Take it, I smiled. A few weeks later, they called, screaming. Hello everyone. Go ahead and get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of coffee. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let me take you into this story. My name is Beverly, and this is the story of how my husband's family tried to steal my inheritance and ended up losing everything. It all really starts with my grandmother. She was the toughest woman I've ever known. She worked 3 jobs her whole life, saved every penny, not for herself, but to make sure she had something to leave behind. That something was her gorgeous, rent-controlled apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. You know the kind you see in movies, a 2-bedroom with original hardwood floors, high ceilings that made you feel like you were in a palace, and from the back windows, you could see the trees of Central Park. It was a miracle in New York's impossible housing market. The monthly rent was locked in at just $800, while apartments just down the hall, identical ones, were going for $4,500. It was more than an apartment, it was a gift. It was security. It was the last piece of my grandmother I had left. When she passed away 18 months ago, she left it to me in her will, and I cried for a week, both from grief and from gratitude. My husband, Arthur, and I had been living there for about 15 months. We were happy. Or, at least, I thought we were. We'd walk through the park, hold hands, talk about our future, about kids, about growing old together. I thought we had a foundation built on trust. I learned the hard way that our foundation was built on sand. The trouble started when Arthur's parents, Stanley and Lorraine, decided to retire early. They wanted to move to the city, and that's when his sister, Brenda, showed up at our door. I remember the moment so clearly. I was in the kitchen trying a new recipe, and the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there she was, Brenda, with a smirk on her face and stacks of flattened cardboard boxes under her arm. And a roll of packing tape. Before I could even ask what was going on, she pushed past me. We need to clear space, she declared, not even looking at me. She walked right into the living room, set the boxes down, and started pulling my grandmother's old books off the shelf, the ones I cherished. I just stood there, completely frozen. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Excuse me? I finally managed to say. Brenda barely glanced up. Mom and Dad are moving in next weekend. She said it so casually, like she was announcing the weather. I looked toward the doorway, and that's when I saw Arthur. He was just standing there, frozen, looking as pale as a ghost. We'd been married for 3 years, and I had never, ever seen him look so terrified. My heart started pounding. Arthur, I said, my voice shaking a little. What is she talking about? He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the floor. Brenda answered for him. Oh, Arthur didn't tell you? His parents need somewhere to stay while they look for a place. This apartment is way too big for just you two anyway. The condescending tone in her voice, the way she said you two like we were children playing house, it made my blood run cold. I turned back to my husband who had promised to love and protect me. Arthur. Look at me. What is going on? He finally found his voice, but it was barely a whisper. Beverly, they need help. Dad lost a lot in his 401k and with Mom's medical bills. So they're moving into my apartment? The words hung in the air. My inheritance. My grandmother's legacy. Brenda finally looked up from the box she was packing, her eyes flashing with annoyance. Look, Beverly, this is family business. Arthur owns half of everything in this marriage, including this place. We've already discussed it. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't a surprise visit. This wasn't a desperate plea for help. This was a plan. A calculated, cold-blooded takeover. And my own husband was in on it. The betrayal was so sharp, so sudden, it literally took my breath away. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck. And in that moment, something inside me just snapped. The shock turned into a strange, icy calm. I looked at Brenda, then at my pale, trembling husband. "You want my apartment?" I said. My voice didn't even tremble. It was perfectly level. I almost surprised myself. I smiled. A real, genuine smile. "Take it." I walked straight past them into our bedroom. I grabbed my laptop, my purse, and the small jewelry box my grandmother had given me. That was it. I headed for the door. Arthur finally unfroze. "Beverly, wait. We can figure this out." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and turned to look at him one last time. "You already did figure it out, Arthur. Without me." And I walked out. I didn't look back. I just walked out into the hallway, the sound of the heavy apartment door clicking shut behind me. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely press the button for the ground floor. When the doors opened to the lobby, the doorman, a kind old man named George who had known my grandmother for 30 years, gave me a concerned look. "Everything all right, Beverly?" he asked. I think I just nodded. I couldn't trust myself to speak. The moment I stepped out onto the street, the cold November air hit me, and the dam broke. I stumbled a few feet down the sidewalk before leaning against a wall, and I just sobbed. Deep, ragged breaths. I was homeless. In the span of 20 minutes, my marriage had imploded and I had lost my home. It didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I didn't know where to go. My parents live in Florida, and I didn't want to call them in a panic. The only person I could think of was my best friend, Meredith. We'd been friends since college, and she was the most level-headed person I knew. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with cold and shock, and called her. "Hey, what's up?" she answered cheerfully. "Meredith," I choked out, and that was all I could manage before I started crying again. "Beverly? What is it? What's wrong? Where are you?" I told her the address. She just said, "Don't move. I'm getting in an Uber right now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Waiting for her on that bench felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. When her car pulled up, she jumped out and just wrapped me in a hug. I felt myself just collapse into her. She got me into the car and took me back to her apartment in Brooklyn. She sat me down on her couch, wrapped a blanket around me, and poured me a huge glass of wine. I told her everything. The whole sordid story. Brenda's smug face, Arthur's terrified silence, the packing tape. I told it all in a jumbled, tearful mess. Meredith, who works as a paralegal, just listened. She let me get it all out. She didn't interrupt. She just sat there, her expression growing harder and angrier with every word I said. When I was finally finished, just sitting there exhausted and empty, she didn't say, "I'm so sorry," or "That's terrible." She looked at me with this intense focus and asked the one question that would change everything. "Beverly," she said, her voice sharp. "Whose name is on the lease?" I blinked, confused by the question. What? The lease. The actual, legal document for the apartment. Whose name is on it? I pulled out my phone. My grandmother was meticulous. I had a digital copy of every important document she ever signed. I scrolled through my files and found it. I stared at the screen for a moment, the black and white text blurring through my tears. "Mine," I whispered. "Just mine." Grandma Rose was very specific about that when she transferred it to me. She said it was my safety net. Meredith's eyes widened. She took the phone and read it herself. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. And you're not divorced yet? Divorced? Meredith, we haven't even talked about divorce. This just happened 10 minutes ago. Honey, she said, getting up to pour me another glass of wine. This just happened, but it's been planned for a long, long time. She sat back down and looked me straight in the eye. You need to call a lawyer. First thing tomorrow morning. The next morning, I woke up on Meredith's couch with a pounding headache and a heart full of dread. For a split second, I thought it was all a bad dream. Then the memory of Brenda packing my books, of Arthur's pale face, came rushing back, and the weight settled back into my chest. But alongside the grief, there was something else now, a tiny, flickering flame of anger. Meredith was right. I needed help. She had already been up for hours. On her kitchen table was a cup of coffee and a sticky note with a name and number. Eleanor Vance, it said. Real estate and family law. She's a shark. A nice shark, but a shark nonetheless. I spent an hour pacing around Meredith's apartment, practicing what I would say. It felt surreal, calling a lawyer to talk about my own husband. Finally, I took a deep breath and dialed the number. I got an appointment for that very afternoon. Eleanor Vance's office was in Midtown Manhattan, in one of those sleek glass towers that make you feel small. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows with a stunning view of the bustling streets below. It felt like a world away from the cozy, pre-war apartment I had just lost. Eleanor herself was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair cut in a stylish bob. She wore a perfectly tailored suit and exuded an aura of calm, unshakable confidence. She listened patiently as I recounted the story, her face unreadable. I handed her my phone with the lease documents and the papers from my grandmother's inheritance. She reviewed them in silence for what felt like an eternity. She read every line, her finger tracing the text on the screen. I sat there, picking at a loose thread on the arm of the leather chair, my anxiety growing with every passing second. What if I was wrong? What if Brenda was right and being married meant he really did own half? Finally, she looked up from the phone, and for the first time since I'd walked in, she smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. Your grandmother was a very smart woman, Beverly, she said, her voice crisp and clear. The lease is solely in your name. That's ironclad. But this, she tapped the screen, this is the beautiful part. There's a clause here that specifically states the lease cannot be transferred, sublet, or shared with any new, long-term occupants without the express written consent of the original tenant. She looked right at me. That's you. A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost made me dizzy. So, he can't just move his parents in? Absolutely not, Eleanor confirmed. Your husband has no legal claim to this apartment whatsoever. Not in New York, and not with this type of inherited lease. Since this was an inheritance and the lease predates your marriage, he has zero claim. For him to have any rights, he'd have to prove he contributed to acquiring it, which is impossible. The relief was quickly followed by a surge of pure, hot rage. Rage at Brenda, at her parents, and most of all, at Arthur. They thought they could just take it. They thought I was a fool. What are my options? I asked, my voice steady now. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. You have several. You could go back right now and tell them to leave. You could hire a locksmith and change the locks while they're out. Or... She paused, and her smile turned predatory. You could let them dig themselves in deeper. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, she said, leaning forward, you let them get comfortable. You let them stay. And then you take legal action for trespassing and damages. If they're living there without your permission, and you can prove damages, utilities they're using, wear and tear on the property, even lost potential rent if you had decided to sublet it legally, you could sue them. And, she added, her eyes glinting, if your husband actively assisted in this illegal occupation, you would have grounds for a very, very favorable divorce settlement. I sat back, my mind reeling. Part of me, the angry, hurt part, wanted to storm back there right now and throw every last one of them out onto the street. But another part of me, a colder, more calculating part that sounded suspiciously like my grandmother's voice, whispered that patience might be the sharper weapon. How long could I wait? I asked. Legally, there's no specific timeline, Eleanor said. The longer you wait, the more evidence you can gather about their intentions. And if they're claiming financial hardship. She smiled again. Then we'd need to verify those claims, wouldn't we? Leaving Eleanor's office, I felt like I had a suit of armor on. The grief was still there, but now it was coated in a layer of cold, hard resolve. Verifying their claims, that was the key. Arthur's whole excuse was built on the story of his parents' financial ruin. I needed to know if it was true. Eleanor had recommended a private investigator. The name sounded like something out of an old movie, Walter Pierce. She said he was the best at digging into family financial matters. I met him the next day at a small, quiet diner in Little Italy. I was expecting a guy in a trench coat. Instead, Walter was a man in his 60s with kind eyes, graying hair, and a cozy-looking cardigan. He looked more like a college professor than a PI. He ordered an espresso, stirred 2 sugars into it, and looked at me over the rim of his cup. I've been doing this for 30 years, he said, his voice soft but steady. Most of my cases are cheating spouses, insurance fraud. Family financial investigations, they're more delicate. How so? I asked. Because usually, he said, the people involved aren't master criminals. They're just selfish. And selfish people tend to be sloppy about covering their tracks. I gave him all the information I had, Stanley and Lorraine Patterson, Arthur's claims about the 401k, the story about the medical bills. He wrote it all down in a small notebook with a meticulous hand. I'll look into their finances, he said. If they're claiming hardship but have significant assets, that could be very useful for your lawyer. I spent the next week in a haze. I stayed with Meredith, sleeping on her couch, but I barely slept. During the day, I went to my marketing job and tried to act normal. I sat through meetings about social media campaigns and brand partnerships, smiling at colleagues who asked how married life was treating me. It's great, I'd lie, a bitter taste in my mouth. It was surreal, living this double life, waiting for a phone call that would either confirm my husband was a liar or that I had misjudged everything. Every night, Arthur would call or text. The messages started as concerned, then grew more desperate. Beverly, please call me. We need to talk. Mom is crying every night. She's worried about you. Dad's health isn't good. This stress is bad for him. Can't we just work this out like adults? I saved every single message, but I never responded. Eleanor had told me to document everything. She said their attempts at emotional manipulation could be useful later. Exactly 1 week after I hired him, Walter called. I have something for you, he said. Can you meet? We met at the same diner. He slid a thin folder across the table. They were sloppy, he said, taking a sip of his espresso. I opened the folder, my heart pounding. Inside were financial documents, bank records, public filings. It didn't take a genius to understand what I was looking at. Walter was right. Stanley Patterson, my father-in-law, hadn't lost money in his 401k. The record showed a clean withdrawal of $150,000, made 3 months prior. He hadn't lost it in the market, he had taken it out. He faced some early withdrawal penalties, sure, Walter explained, pointing to a line item. But the money itself? He invested it. In his brother's new restaurant in Princeton. He slid a newspaper clipping across the table. It was a glowing review of a new Italian place called Patello's. The restaurant is doing very well, Walter said. Waiting list for weekend reservations. My hands started to shake. It was all a lie. But it got worse. And the mother's medical bills, Walter continued, turning a page. Lorraine Patterson had a minor outpatient procedure last year to remove a benign cyst. Her insurance covered almost all of it. He pointed to the final bill. Their total out-of-pocket expense was exactly $1,847. I just sat there, staring at the papers. $1,847. They were willing to destroy my marriage, take my home, and throw my life into chaos for less than $2,000. They weren't struggling. They were greedy. They just wanted a luxury apartment in Manhattan for next to nothing, and they were willing to use any lie, any manipulation, to get it. And my husband, Arthur, had stood there and let it happen. He had fed me that same lie, with tears in his eyes. I thought the discoveries about Stanley and Lorraine were the worst of it. I was wrong. The real bombshell was still waiting in Walter's folder. There's more, he said, his expression turning serious. I did some digging on your sister-in-law, Brenda. He slid another set of papers across the table. These weren't financial records. They were printouts from LinkedIn, screenshots of emails, and even a full PowerPoint presentation. Brenda works as a so-called real estate consultant, Walter explained. She has a very specific niche. She specializes in helping people maximize the value of rent-controlled properties. I flipped through the pages, feeling sick to my stomach. She was advertising herself as an expert in creative housing solutions for families with valuable lease agreements. There were case studies, anonymous, of course, detailing her successes. One involved convincing an elderly woman to add her grandson's name to her lease right before she passed away, effectively bypassing the landlord and keeping the apartment in the family. Another detailed how to establish family occupancy in a rent-controlled unit to prevent legal challenges. This wasn't just a one-time, desperate plan for her parents. This was her business model. She was a professional predator. This is what she does, I whispered, more to myself than to Walter. It gets better, he said grimly. I found a chain of emails between Brenda and a real estate broker here in Manhattan. They started about a month before she showed up at your door. He pointed to the last printout. My eyes scanned the text. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. In the emails, Brenda was already discussing the logistics of illegally subletting my apartment. My apartment. She was planning to rent it out for $4,000 a month, pocketing the difference, all while keeping the official rent at my grandmother's $800 rate. Her parents moving in was just the first step, a smokescreen to establish occupancy and get me out of the picture. The end goal was to turn my inheritance into her personal cash machine. The betrayal was absolute. It was complete. This wasn't just about helping her parents. This wasn't just about greed. This was a cold, calculated, fraudulent scheme, and I was just a pawn to be removed from the board. And Arthur, my husband, he was either the world's biggest fool or a willing participant. At that point, I wasn't sure which was worse. I looked up at Walter, the folder spread out before me like the scene of a crime. I need you to document everything, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Every email, every financial record, every conversation you can verify. Already on it, he said softly. But Beverly, I have to ask. What's your endgame here? I looked out the diner window at the busy New York street, watching people hurry past, lost in their own lives. I thought about my grandmother, working her fingers to the bone to keep that apartment. I thought about the future Arthur and I were supposed to have, now turned to ash. I don't just want them out of my apartment, I said, turning back to him. I want them to face real consequences for what they did. Real, legal consequences. That afternoon, I called Eleanor and scheduled another meeting. I walked into her office, no longer a victim, but a woman armed with evidence. I laid Walter's folder on her polished conference table. She reviewed the documents with the same focused intensity as before, but this time, her expression wasn't smiling. It was deadly serious. When she finally looked up, she said, "Beverly, this changes everything. We're not just talking about a family dispute over housing anymore." She tapped the folder. "This is organized fraud." Organized fraud. The words hung in the air of Eleanor's office. It sounded so serious, so criminal. "What kind of fraud, exactly?" I asked. "Brenda has been operating what amounts to a consulting business built around illegally manipulating rent-controlled leases," Eleanor explained, her voice sharp. "That's a serious offense in New York. The penalties can include fines up to $50,000 and potential jail time." Jail time. The idea sent a flutter of nervous excitement through me. This was real. "And Arthur," Eleanor continued, "if we can prove he was aware of Brenda's broader business and participated in the scheme knowingly, he could face conspiracy charges as well." She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "But Beverly, I need you to understand what you're considering. Pursuing criminal fraud charges will destroy their lives. Brenda could go to prison. Arthur could lose his job, any professional licenses he has, his ability to get credit or housing in the future. This is the nuclear option." I met her gaze without flinching. "They were willing to destroy my life for money," I said. "I know," she replied. "I just need to make sure you understand the full scope of what we're about to do." I did. And I was ready. The district attorney's office was interested. Very interested. As it turned out, they had been looking for a solid case to crack down on this exact type of rent-controlled lease fraud. Brenda's little consulting business was exactly the pattern they wanted to make an example of. The next step, they said, was to get one of them to admit to the scheme on record. They wanted me to try to get Brenda or Arthur to acknowledge that this was all planned in advance and that money was the primary motivation. The idea of secretly recording my own husband made my stomach turn, but then I thought about all the lies, all the gaslighting, all the ways he had betrayed our marriage. The sickness turned to resolve. "What do I need to do?" I asked Eleanor. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I called Arthur. He answered on the first ring, his voice filled with a desperate, palpable relief. "Beverly." "Thank God." "Where are you?" "We need to talk." "I want to meet for coffee," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "We can talk then." We met at a Starbucks near my office. He was there first, looking terrible. He was unshaven, his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. A small, pathetic part of me felt a pang of pity for him, but I pushed it down. He had made his choices. My phone was in my purse on the table between us, its recording app silently capturing every word. "Beverly, I'm so sorry," he began, his hands trembling around his coffee cup. "I know I handled everything wrong. I need you to help me understand something, Arthur," I said, cutting him off. "When did Brenda first suggest that your parents should move into my apartment?" He shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't like that. She didn't just suggest it." "Then how did it happen?" I pressed. "You have to understand, my family was really struggling," he mumbled, falling back on the old lie. This was my moment. "Were they, though?" I asked quietly. "Because I've been looking into their finances, Arthur." His head snapped up. His face went from pale to chalk white. What do you mean?" "I mean your father's $150,000 restaurant investment. I mean your mother's minor medical procedure that cost less than $2,000. I mean Brenda's real estate consulting business that specializes in taking advantage of people like me." He just stared at his coffee cup, his whole body seeming to shrink. The silence stretched on for a full minute. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Not tears of remorse, I realized. Tears of being caught. How much do you know? He whispered. I know enough, I said. What I want to know is how much you knew. I swear to you, Beverly, I had no idea about Brenda's business, he said, his voice pleading. She told me she was just helping families with housing problems. I didn't know she was charging money for it. But you knew your parents weren't really struggling financially, I stated. It wasn't a question. He hesitated. I knew Dad had made the restaurant investment, he admitted. But Mom was really worried about money after her procedure, and Brenda, she convinced all of us that this was just a temporary solution that would help everyone. Temporary, I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. She said once they got settled, they'd find their own place. She even said you'd probably be happier in a smaller apartment anyway, since one-bedrooms are easier to maintain. He said it without even realizing what he was admitting. She wasn't just planning for them to stay temporarily. She was planning to push me out permanently. Arthur, I said, leaning in. Brenda was already talking to brokers about subletting my apartment illegally. She was going to charge market rate while paying my grandmother's rent. This was never about helping your parents. It was about her making a profit off my inheritance. His face crumpled. Oh, God, Beverly. I had no idea. Did you really not know? I asked, my voice cold. Or did you just not want to know because it was easier to believe the lie? He didn't have an answer. After another long silence, he finally whispered, "What happens now?" I looked him straight in the eye. Now, criminal fraud charges are being filed, Arthur. Brenda is going to be arrested. The only question is whether you're going to be arrested with her. Arthur's hands were shaking so violently he had to put his coffee cup down. Criminal charges? He stammered. What are you talking about? Conspiracy? Fraud? This is insane. Is it insane, Arthur? I shot back. Or is it the logical consequence of a plan to steal someone's home? You call it a family problem. The district attorney calls it organized fraud. They're looking at everything: theft, conspiracy, maybe even racketeering if they can prove Brenda's been doing this with other families. Please, Beverly, he begged, his voice cracking. I know I messed up, but I never intended for any of this to happen. Intent doesn't always matter when it comes to fraud, I said, parroting what Eleanor had told me. What matters is what you did and what you knew. But, I leaned forward, delivering the offer the DA had authorized: if you cooperate with the investigation, if you're honest about what Brenda told you and when, it might make a difference for you. He stared at me, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief. You're asking me to testify against my own sister. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what she did to our marriage, I replied. I left him sitting there, a broken man in a busy coffee shop. The recording was clean. I sent it to Eleanor, who forwarded it to the DA. The criminal case was moving forward. But that was a slow-moving train. I wanted a faster one. While they were living in my apartment, I had continued to pay the $800 rent, the utilities, everything. I wasn't going to give the landlord any reason to question the lease. But I was also documenting every penny. Meanwhile, I needed to know what they were doing inside my home. A few days after my meeting with Arthur, I called him. I put on my best fake concerned voice. Hey, I was just thinking about your parents, I said. How are they settling in? There was a pause. They're grateful, he said cautiously. Dad's already talking about how much money they'll save. That's wonderful, I said, my voice dripping with fake sweetness. I'm sure they'll be very comfortable in my apartment. I heard him wince over the phone. I decided to press a little harder. So, are they liking the place? Have they made it their own yet? He took the bait. Oh, yeah, she loves it. Mom's already talking about redecorating the living room. She wants to paint the main wall beige. And Dad's looking into getting all the walls repainted soon. Bingo. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. They're redecorating my apartment, I said flatly. Beverly, please don't think of it like that, he pleaded. We're all family. Right. Family. I hung up and immediately called Eleanor. They're making permanent changes to the property, I told her, my voice trembling with rage. Redecorating. Painting. This isn't temporary. They intend to stay. Perfect, Eleanor said, her voice like a steel trap. That shows intent to permanently occupy. It strengthens our civil case immensely. How do you want to proceed? I want them out, I said. All of them. Now. The next morning, Eleanor sent a formal notice via courier to Arthur at the apartment. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was a cold, hard legal document. It politely but clearly stated that he and his family were trespassing on private property and had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises or face legal action, including a lawsuit for eviction, damages, and fraudulent misrepresentation. Arthur called me within an hour of receiving it, his voice hysterical. Beverly, what the hell is this? A lawyer? Really? Are you trying to make my parents homeless? I was done being quiet. You moved your parents into my apartment without asking me, Arthur. You lied to me about your finances. You plotted with your sister to take my inheritance. What did you think was going to happen? I thought you'd be reasonable. They're family, he shouted. They're your family, I replied, my voice dangerously calm. And you are all trespassing. I know everything, Arthur. I know about your father's restaurant. I know about your mother's minor medical bills. I know this was never about helping them. This was about greed. The line went quiet. I could practically hear his brain short-circuiting. Beverly, please, he finally whispered. Let's just talk about this face to face. 72 hours, Arthur, I said. The letter explains everything. And I hung up. The 72 hours that followed were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I stayed with Meredith, barely eating, just staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. Every time it buzzed, my heart would leap into my throat. Would it be Arthur, saying they were packing? Would it be his mother, crying and begging? Would it be Brenda, screaming threats? It was all of the above. First, Lorraine, my mother-in-law, called me, sobbing. Beverly, honey, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, she cried. Jake told me you inherited this place, but I thought it was something you two bought together. We never would have. Mrs. Patterson, I cut her off, my voice polite but firm. Did Brenda and Arthur tell you that you could live in my apartment? Well, yes, but... Then your misunderstanding is with them, not with me, I said. I'm sorry you were given incorrect information, but I need you and your family to leave my property. I hung up before she could start crying again. Next was Stanley, my father-in-law. He tried a different tactic, the reasonable, disappointed dad. Beverly, this is Bob, he said, using his folksy nickname. I want you to know, I had no idea this would cause problems between you and my boy. If I had known, we never would have accepted his offer. Mr. Patterson, I said, my patience wearing thin. Your daughter Brenda was the one packing my belongings into boxes. She knew exactly whose apartment this was. Well, Lindsay said, she said a lot of things. I think maybe we got some bad information. You did, I said. And now you have the correct information. The clock is ticking. Finally, Brenda called. There was no crying, no apologies. Just pure, venomous rage. You are being ridiculous, Beverly, she spat into the phone. Arthur is your husband. What's his is yours and what's yours is his. That's how marriage works. That's not how the law works, Brenda, I replied calmly. Fine. Be petty. But you're destroying your marriage over an apartment. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. I'm not destroying anything, Brenda. You and Arthur already took care of that. I hung up and blocked all their numbers. The 72 hours came and went. The deadline passed at noon on a Thursday. I sat with Meredith, staring at the clock on the wall. 12:01, 12:02. My phone remained silent. They weren't leaving. They were calling my bluff. On day 4, as promised, Eleanor filed the paperwork with the court for an emergency eviction order. On day 5, we got a response. They had hired their own lawyer, clearly a cheap one, who sent a blustering letter claiming common law marriage rights and demanding mediation to discuss Arthur's stake in the property. I forwarded it to Eleanor, my heart sinking. Was this going to be a long, drawn-out fight? Her reply came back in minutes. All it said was, LOL. She called me a moment later, actually laughing. Common law marriage isn't recognized in New York, Beverly, she chuckled. And even if it was, it wouldn't give him any rights to an inherited property with a pre-existing lease agreement. This is the legal equivalent of a toddler throwing a tantrum. They have nothing. The judge will see right through this. And she was right. 3 weeks later, after their lawyer's pathetic attempts to delay were dismissed by a very annoyed judge, the court granted our eviction order. A certified copy was delivered to the apartment. The sheriff would be there the following Monday at 9:30 a.m. to ensure the family vacated the premises. The final confrontation was set. If you're still listening, could you do me a huge favor and like this video and comment the number 1 down below? It lets me know you've given me a thumbs up and that you're here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement for me. Please, just comment the number 1 and then listen to what happened next. That Monday morning, the air was crisp and clear, the kind of beautiful autumn day that feels like a fresh start. It seemed fitting. I met Eleanor on the corner a block away from my building at 9 a.m. She was wearing another sharp suit, looking calm and professional. I, on the other hand, felt like a bundle of nerves. My hands were freezing, and my stomach was doing backflips. Are you ready for this? She asked gently. I took a deep breath. I just want it to be over, I said. We walked to the building and waited in the lobby. George, the doorman, gave me a small, supportive nod. He knew. At 9:30 on the dot, 2 sheriff's deputies walked in. They were polite, professional, and all business. They confirmed my identity, looked at the court order, and then we all rode the elevator up together in silence. When we got to my apartment door, one of the deputies knocked loudly. Sheriff's Department, he announced. There was a long pause, then the sound of scrambling from inside. The door opened a crack, and Stanley's face appeared. He looked tired and defeated. Yes, he asked. Sir, we have a court order for you and your family to vacate these premises immediately, the deputy said, handing him the papers. You need to gather your belongings and leave now. The door opened fully. The scene inside was one of chaotic retreat. Boxes were half-packed, furniture was askew. It was clear they hadn't believed it would really happen until this very moment. Watching them carry their things out of my apartment was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected, but it was also deeply, profoundly sad. This was my family. This was the pathetic end to my marriage. Lorraine looked embarrassed, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She kept apologizing to the deputies, as if they were personally inconvenienced by her situation. Stanley was quiet and grim, just focused on moving boxes. Arthur couldn't even look at me. He kept his head down, his shoulders slumped, a stranger in the home we were supposed to share. He looked completely broken. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a vast, empty space where my love for him used to be. But Brenda was furious. She wasn't embarrassed or sad. She was incandescent with rage. "This is insane," she shouted as she carried out a box of kitchen items I recognized as her mother's. "You're throwing family out on the street. For an apartment." "Ma'am, please keep your voice down," one of the deputies said calmly. She whirled on me, her face twisted in a snarl. "You're going to regret this, Beverly. You'll be all alone in this big, empty place. I hope you're happy." I just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, and watched them. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The court order, the deputies, the boxes in the hallway, they said everything for me. After they had carried the last box out and shuffled down the hall to the elevator, a silence fell over the apartment. It was finally over. The deputies did a quick walkthrough, wished me luck, and left. Eleanor and I walked through the rooms, surveying the damage. They hadn't been there long, but they had left their mark. There was a hideous swatch of beige paint on one of the living room walls where Lorraine had been testing colors. There were nail holes everywhere from where they had hung their pictures. The beautiful hardwood floors had several new, deep scratches. In the bathroom, they had installed a new shower curtain rod incorrectly, cracking one of my grandmother's original tiles. Eleanor took photos of everything with her phone. "This is good," she said, her voice all business. "This is property damage. We can add this to the lawsuit." That afternoon, I had my apartment back. I spent the rest of the day just walking through it, touching the walls, looking out the windows. It felt like mine again. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was home. Getting my apartment back was the first victory, but it wasn't the end. The very next week, Eleanor filed the divorce papers. We also filed a civil lawsuit against Arthur, Brenda, Stanley, and Lorraine for trespassing, property damage, and, this was the big one, fraud. The property damage was easy to prove. Eleanor had the photos and I got estimates for repairs. Refinishing the scratched floors, repairing the cracked tile, and repainting the entire living room to cover up that awful beige swatch came to a total of $3,200. The trespassing was obvious. But the fraud charge was what really scared them. Eleanor included a summary of Walter's investigation in the filing, the evidence of their fabricated financial hardship and, most damningly, Brenda's detailed plan to illegally sublet the apartment for profit. She made it clear that we had the emails, the financial records, and the recorded conversation with Arthur. We had them cornered. Suddenly, their cheap, blustering lawyer was gone. They hired a serious attorney from a big downtown firm. His first move wasn't to fight, but to ask for a settlement conference. They knew they would lose in court, and the discovery process for a fraud case would expose every dirty little secret they had. They wanted this to go away, quietly and quickly. The settlement conference was held 6 weeks after the eviction, in a sterile, soulless conference room at the new lawyer's firm. I walked in with Eleanor, my head held high. On the other side of a long, polished table sat Arthur, his parents, and Brenda. They were all there, along with their 2 new, expensive-looking lawyers. They looked terrible. Arthur had lost even more weight. His parents just looked old and tired, embarrassed to be there. But Brenda still had a defiant look on her face, a simmering rage in her eyes. She sat there with her arms crossed, glaring at me. Her defiance lasted right up until her own lawyer started explaining the potential consequences if the fraud charges went to trial. I watched as he spoke to her in a low, urgent whisper. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the color drain from her face. He probably mentioned things like felony charges, financial audits, and jail time. Eleanor let them sweat for a few minutes before she began. At this point, she said, her voice calm and authoritative, we are willing to settle this civil matter and recommend the DA drop the criminal investigation under the following conditions. She laid out our terms. First, full payment for property damages, which totals $3,200. Second, a formal, written apology from each of you for the emotional distress and illegal actions you have taken. And third, a legally binding agreement that none of you will ever contact, harass, or come within 500 feet of Ms. Beverly or her residence, with all future communication to go exclusively through attorneys. Their lawyer looked at his clients. I would strongly recommend accepting this offer, he said. But Brenda wasn't done. $3,200, she scoffed, her voice shrill. For what? Some nail holes and a little paint? Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shook him off. This is extortion, she hissed. We were just trying to help family. Eleanor just smiled that razor-sharp smile of hers. If you prefer, we can decline to settle, she said pleasantly. We can proceed with a full lawsuit. The discovery process will be very thorough. And the damages we will be seeking for fraud, including punitive awards and legal fees, will likely be in the neighborhood of $50,000. Or more. Plus, she added, that won't stop the separate criminal investigation, which is ongoing. She let that hang in the air. Brenda went pale. Her lawyer shot her a look that could have curdled milk. Then, Stanley, her father, spoke up for the first time. His voice was gravelly. We'll take the settlement. Dad, no! Brenda protested. Brenda, enough, her father snapped, his voice firm in a way I'd never heard before. We never should have gotten involved in this. They agreed to everything. They wrote a check for the damages right there. As we were leaving the conference room, Arthur tried to approach me. Beverly, No direct contact, remember? Eleanor stepped smoothly between us. I could see the desperation in his eyes. He was sorry. He was scared. He wanted to fix things. But the thing is, some things can't be fixed. Some things, once they're broken, are broken for good. 6 months after that settlement meeting, my life had started to feel like my own again. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the eviction. Arthur didn't contest a single thing. He knew he was lucky. He signed whatever papers Eleanor put in front of him. I never saw him or spoke to him again. I used the $3,200 from the settlement to get the work done on the apartment. I had the floors refinished until they shone like glass. I had the cracked tile in the bathroom replaced. I had the entire living room repainted in a warm, beautiful blue. The place looked better than ever. It felt cleansed. I would hear little bits of news about the Patterson family through the grapevine. Meredith had a mutual friend who kept her updated. And honestly, it was a slow-motion train wreck. Apparently, the entire family blamed Brenda for the disaster. She was the one who pushed the plan, who convinced everyone it would work, who turned what they saw as a simple housing arrangement into a criminal conspiracy. The legal bills from their expensive lawyers had been enormous, and the stress had fractured the family completely. Arthur, unable to afford Manhattan rent on his own salary, had moved back in with his parents in New Jersey. Back into his childhood bedroom at 32 years old. The criminal investigation into Arthur had been dropped as part of the settlement, but Brenda wasn't so lucky. She had to agree to permanently cease her consulting business and, as we later found out, pay restitution to 2 other families she had scammed in the past. The DA had her in a corner, and she knew it. But the story doesn't end there. The universe, it seems, has a wicked sense of irony. About a month ago, I got a call from Eleanor. You are not going to believe this, she said, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. I just got a call from a colleague who represents a landlord in Queens. He's evicting a tenant for illegal subletting. Guess who the tenant is? Brenda. It was Brenda. Apparently, she had been illegally subletting her own rent-stabilized apartment for the past 2 years. Her landlord found out during our investigation when her name got flagged, and he immediately started eviction proceedings against her. The woman who tried to steal my home was now being kicked out of her own. And it got even worse for them. Arthur's parents, Stanley and Lorraine, were separating. Apparently, the stress of the lawsuit, the mountain of legal bills, and the shame of it all had shattered their marriage. And that restaurant investment? The one Stanley had cashed out his 401k for? His brother, the business partner, had turned out to be a crook. He took the money and disappeared. Stanley lost almost the entire $150,000. I should have felt bad for them. These were people I once considered family. But honestly, as I sat there in my beautiful, sunlit apartment, looking out at the park, I felt nothing but a profound sense of relief that I'd gotten away from all of them before their chaos and toxicity consumed my life, too. Brenda, now evicted and broke, had to move back in with her parents, the same parents who were in the middle of a bitter separation, partly because of her schemes. The irony was almost poetic. The woman who built a business on manipulating housing situations was now homeless, sleeping on the floor of her childhood bedroom in a house torn apart by her own greed. Life moves on. The anger and the hurt, they fade. They leave scars, of course, but eventually, they stop being open wounds. It's been 8 months now since this all started. I'm still living in my grandmother's apartment, and I think about her every day. I think she would have been proud of how I handled things. A few weeks ago, something unexpected happened. I was in the grocery store on the corner, picking out vegetables, when I looked up and saw her. Lorraine Patterson. My ex-mother-in-law. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the produce section. Then, she did something I never expected. She walked over to me. "Beverly," she said, her voice quiet. "I want you to know how truly sorry I am. I should have questioned Brenda's plan from the beginning. I knew it felt wrong." I could see genuine regret in her eyes. It was the first real apology I had received from any of them. "I'm sorry to hear about your separation from Stanley," I said, and I meant it. She nodded sadly. 32 years of marriage, she said, looking down at her hands. And it took Brenda's schemes to show me how different our values really were. "Stanley, he still thinks we were justified in trying to take your apartment." "And you don't?" I asked. "I think we were scared about money," she admitted. "And we let Brenda convince us that taking advantage of you was somehow acceptable because we were family." She paused, then looked me in the eye. "But family doesn't treat family that way." She told me she'd gotten a job as a receptionist and was renting a small studio apartment in Queens. She seemed ashamed, but also relieved to be out from under the toxic dynamics that had consumed her family. Before she left, she asked the one question I had been dreading. "How is Arthur?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "He's struggling," she said. "He talks about you sometimes. Wonders if you're happy." She looked at me carefully. "Are you?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm learning to be," I said. "It takes time to trust people again after something like this." "I know I have no right to ask this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But if Arthur tried to make amends, would you consider talking to him?" I gave her a small, sad smile. "Mrs. Patterson," I said gently. "Arthur had his chance to make amends. He had his chance to stand up for me, to be my husband. He chose to protect Brenda instead of his marriage. Some choices can't be undone." She nodded, accepting my answer. After she left, I stood there for a long time, right next to the avocados. I felt sorry for Lorraine. But I also felt proud of myself for holding my ground. Sometimes people ask me if I regret being so harsh. If maybe I could have been more understanding. But here's what I learned: when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time. Arthur wasn't a victim. He was a willing participant. His parents were quick to go along with the deception when it benefited them. And Brenda, she was perfectly comfortable destroying my life for her own gain. I saved myself from a lifetime of dealing with people who saw me not as a partner, but as an opportunity. The apartment is quiet now. Peaceful. I've started dating again. A wonderful man named Paul. He's a teacher, he's kind, and he makes me laugh. When I finally got the courage to tell him this whole crazy story, he just shook his head and said, "Your ex-husband is an idiot. This place is incredible." And I smiled, looking around the living room, my living room, and said, "Yes, it is. And it's mine." My grandmother used to tell me, "Beverly, never let anyone convince you that being kind means letting them walk all over you. Real family doesn't ask you to give up what's rightfully yours." She was right. And I'm finally, truly home. And so, Beverly's story reminds us of the profound importance of self-worth and resilience. Life often tests us in the most unexpected ways, revealing the true faces of those around us. Beverly's journey shows that standing firm for what is right, even when it feels isolating or overwhelming, is an act of courage that protects not only our possessions but also our dignity and peace of mind. It is a testament to the power of boundaries and the strength it takes to uphold them. This story also highlights the value of integrity and the consequences of greed. When we choose to act with honesty and respect, we build relationships and a life grounded in trust. When we don't, as seen here, the fallout can be devastating. It's a lesson to cherish what we have, honor those who came before us, and never compromise our values for temporary gains. What do you think about Beverly's decision? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts below, or simply comment good if this story inspired you. Let's reflect and grow together.